Most organizations still talk about ServiceNow like it's the ticketing system. They are wrong. Ticketing was the entry point, not the destination. The real enterprise problem isn't too many tools. It's that work has no single state, no owner, and no enforceable path from someone asked to it's done. Microsoft is where intent shows up. Chats, emails, meetings, documents. ServiceNow is where intent becomes execution. Routing, approvals, evidence, audit. In the next hour, this will get painfully obvious because workflows don't fail in theory. They fail in your org chart. The enterprise workflow problem. Digitally rich, operationally fragmented. Enterprises are digitally rich. They have Microsoft 365, they have an ERP, they have a dozen best-of-breed tools for security, HR, facilities, finance, procurement, customer operations, and whatever else someone bought during the last incident review. And they're still operationally fragmented because having systems isn't the same as having an operating layer. What most environments actually have is a collection of queues, inboxes, Teams channels, portals, ticket forms, Excel trackers, and shared mailboxes. Each queue has local truth. None of them have end-to-end truth. That distinction matters. The typical day looks like this. Someone starts in Teams or Outlook because that's where people actually work. They describe a need, new laptop, new access, purchase approval, urgent security alert, production outage. Intent is created as a message, not a record. Then the system forces a context switch. Go to a portal, find the right form, pick the right category, attach the right screenshot, retype the same story you already wrote in chat. Submit, wait, follow up again. This is not a user experience problem, it's an execution model problem. Every time someone jumps from Teams to a portal to an email thread to a spreadsheet and back again, the organization is paying a tax. It's not just time, it's loss of state, loss of accountability, and loss of evidence. People don't remember what they did, they remember where they did it. And that becomes the root cause of, we don't know what happened. The worst part is what happens next: manual handoffs, approvals, escalations, exceptions, quick favors, side channel decisions in chat. These are entropy generators. They feel fast in the moment and they're catastrophic later, because each exception bypasses the thing that makes an enterprise predictable, a controlled sequence of steps with clear ownership and an audit trail that survives turnover and panic. So you end up with a business that can produce documents, send messages, and host meetings at industrial scale, but can't reliably move work across boundaries. And that's why visibility fails. Locally, everyone can see their piece. I sent the email. I approved in chat. I deployed the fix. Procurement is looking at it. Security said it was fine. Each team has a story. End to end, nobody has the state machine. You get status everywhere and progress nowhere. Now, the comfortable objection is, but we have an ERP. Yes, you do. It records transactions. It doesn't route work. It's designed to preserve integrity, not orchestrate humans. An ERP is a system of record. That's not an insult. That's the point. It's slow by design because correctness matters more than speed. The next objection is, but we have Microsoft 365. Yes, you do. It creates artifacts, emails, documents, meetings, chats, tasks. It captures intent extremely well, but it doesn't enforce intent. It doesn't guarantee sequence. It doesn't decide who owns the next step. It doesn't compel evidence. It's a productivity surface, not an execution engine. So organizations try to patch the gap with automation. They build small flows, post a message, create a task, mirror a notification. Then those flows multiply, ownership disappears, and governance never shows up. Shadow automation is not innovation. It's integration debt with a friendly UI. And the longer it runs, the worse it gets. Connectors get overscoped to make it work. Service accounts become permanent superusers and nobody remembers why. This is the foundational mistake. Treating workflows like a side feature of tools, instead of treating workflows as the thing the enterprise runs on. Because the enterprise already runs on workflows. They're just undocumented and unowned. Onboarding isn't an HR ticket. It's a cross-domain supply chain. Identity, access, hardware, payroll, compliance, and training. Security incident response isn't a Teams chat. It's a controlled sequence of containment actions with approvals and evidence. Finance approvals aren't an email thread. They're policy enforcement with segregation of duties and auditability. Major incidents aren't a war room. They're coordinated human communication plus authoritative execution and change control. So when people say tool sprawl, they're not wrong. But the real problem is workflow fragmentation. Work starts in one place, gets decided in another, gets executed in a third, and gets documented maybe in a fourth. And that is the missing operating layer between people and systems. It is not optional. It will exist either by design, with governance, or by accident, with entropy. The foundational misunderstanding: tickets track pain, workflows control outcomes. Here's what most people miss. A ticket is not a workflow. A ticket is a container for pain. It's a log entry that says something is wrong or someone wants something. It's useful because enterprises need triage. They need queues, they need assignment, they need SLAs. But tickets don't control outcomes. Tickets just describe the problem while humans improvise a path to resolution. That sounds pedantic. It isn't. Because when an organization believes tickets are the operating model, it starts optimizing for the wrong things. Faster logging, better categorization, cleaner fields, nicer dashboards. Meanwhile, the real failure remains untouched. Work still moves through side channels. Approvals still happen in meetings, and exceptions still get granted by whoever shouts loudest in teams. A workflow is different. A workflow is a control system. It defines sequence, ownership, and evidence. It makes the path from requested to done repeatable. It doesn't just track the thing that happened. It creates the conditions for the thing to happen predictably. That's why Beyond ITSM is not marketing, it's a category shift. ITSM is the first place most enterprises meet workflow discipline because incidents and requests force the conversation. But the minute you cross into cross-domain work and HR, security, finance, facilities, the ticket model starts lying to you. Take the three classic ITIL shapes. Incidents are interruptions. They demand speed and coordination. Requests are supply chain. They need fulfillment, approvals, and inventory-like thinking. Changes are risk management. They exist to prevent you from making a bad day worse. Now watch what happens when you treat all three like a ticket. You build one intake form, one queue, one set of statuses, and then you rely on humans to do the orchestration in their heads. That's where drift starts. Because the moment reality gets messy, onboarding a VP, responding to an incident, trying to buy something before quarter end, the workflow gets replaced by just do it. Approvals happen in chat. Access gets granted temporarily. Procurement bypasses checks. Security says we'll document later, and later never arrives. That's the entropy pattern. A shortcut under pressure becomes the real process. And this is where cross-domain work breaks ticket thinking completely. Onboarding is not an HR ticket plus an IT ticket. It's one workflow with dependencies. Hire date triggers identity, identity triggers access, access triggers device provisioning triggers security baselines trigger compliance confirmations. If that chain isn't enforced somewhere, you get chaos disguised as productivity. Same with access requests, same with procurement, same with security response. A ticket can sit in a queue and still be open. That's fine for pain tracking. But it tells you nothing about throughput, bottlenecks, or risk. You can close a ticket and still have the wrong access assigned. You can resolve an incident and still have the same conditions that caused it. You can implement a change and have zero evidence for why the blast radius was acceptable. So the reframe is simple. Ticketing is a visibility tool. Workflows are an execution tool, and the enterprise doesn't get punished for missing visibility. It gets punished for missing execution, because execution is where risk accumulates. Who approved, who changed what evidence exists, what controls were bypassed, and what is now permanently true in your environment because someone needed it done. So when leaders say, we need to get beyond ITSM, what they usually mean, without having the words for it, is we need enterprise request fulfillment and orchestration. We need an operating layer that makes work deterministic even when humans are not. That's the platform lens executives actually fund. Not apps, not tickets, operating layers. And once you see that, the Microsoft and ServiceNow split stops being confusing. It becomes obvious. Platform, not product. Systems of record versus systems of action. Executives keep buying platforms. But most of what gets implemented is still treated like a product. A portal, a ticket form, a reporting dashboard, an AI add-on, a new license tier. That's how you end up with expensive tooling and the same operational outcomes. The useful lens is older and much less exciting. System of record versus system of action. A system of record is where truth lives. It's authoritative data, governed fields, auditability and retention. It's built to be correct, durable, and defensible. The price of that durability is friction, approvals, controls, and slower change velocity. ERP is the obvious example, so is your HRS. And yes, ServiceNow can be a system of record for certain operational data too. A system of action is where work moves. It routes tasks, enforces sequencing, captures decisions, and produces outcomes with evidence. It's designed for throughput. It has to handle humans, exceptions, and time pressure without turning into folklore. Most organizations try to force their systems of record to behave like systems of action. They attach a workflow to an ERP transaction and call it orchestration. Or they treat Microsoft 365 artifacts, emails, planner tasks, Teams messages as if they are a process state. That mistake doesn't show up in a demo. It shows up when the CFO asks, who approved this? And the answer is, it was in a chat thread. Or when security asks, who authorized that privilege elevation? And the answer is, we agreed in the war room. Documents aren't state, chat isn't governance. A mailbox is not an audit trail. And here's the part that makes architects uncomfortable. A system of action must behave like a state machine. That's not a metaphor. It's a requirement. There has to be an authoritative definition of where this work is, what happens next, who can move it, and what evidence is required to move it. If the work can progress by someone typing approved into Teams, you do not have a state machine. You have conditional chaos. This is why we have M365 doesn't solve execution. Microsoft is exceptional at capturing intent and providing collaboration surfaces. It is not designed to be the authoritative engine that enforces enterprise sequence, policy, and evidence across domains. It will happily host a conversation where the bypass decision gets made. It will not stop you from doing it. And this is why we have an ERP doesn't solve execution. ERP will preserve the transaction after the fact. It won't coordinate the human chain of approvals, exception handling, and downstream tasks that make the transaction legitimate in the first place. So enterprises need both layers. System of record underneath. Authoritative data, integrity, compliance. System of action above it, orchestration, routing, enforcement, audit surface for execution. The mistake is believing one replaces the other. That's also why ServiceNow's gravity keeps expanding beyond ITSM. It's not because IT tickets are exciting. It's because the enterprise keeps discovering the same gap. There is no shared execution layer between people said a thing and systems changed a thing. ServiceNow fits that gap because it can hold state across domains, tie tasks and approvals together, enforce policy gates, and produce evidence. It turns we should into we did, with a trail you can actually defend. And Microsoft fits the other half because it owns where humans actually live. Teams, Outlook, SharePoint, Word, meetings, calls. That's where intent shows up. That's where decisions get discussed. That's where people demand status. So the correct architecture isn't ServiceNow versus Microsoft. It's a split brain model by design. Microsoft is the engagement plane. Capture intent, collaboration, communication, context. ServiceNow is the execution plane. Authoritative state, routing, approvals, evidence. Once you accept that, the rest of the episode stops sounding like theory. It becomes an operating pattern. And now the only question worth asking is, what happens when those two planes get stitched together correctly, without letting governance evaporate? One sentence each. The Microsoft ServiceNow. Power split. ServiceNow, in one sentence, it's the enterprise execution engine, the place where work becomes a governed state machine, not a conversation. Microsoft, in one sentence, it's the productivity and intelligence surface, the place where humans generate intent, context, and pressure. That's the split, and it's not philosophical, it's architectural jurisdiction. Most organizations keep trying to crown one platform as the single pane of glass. That instinct is understandable. It's also how you end up with a pane of glass full of cracks. Because the problem isn't visibility. The problem is ownership of state. Microsoft owns human behavior, Teams chats, Outlook threads, meetings, documents. That's where intent shows up. ServiceNow owns operational truth. The current state, the next owner, the approvals, the gates, and the evidence. That's execution. So the partnership story becomes obvious when you strip away the press releases. The goal isn't to merge products. The goal is to reduce context switching without collapsing governance. Teams is where the request starts because that's where people are. ServiceNow is where the request stays coherent because that's where process lives. Microsoft gives you the easiest place to ask. ServiceNow gives you the hardest thing to build, an operating layer that keeps working after the chat scrolls away. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Platforms beat point solutions because entropy scales faster than your org chart. Every time a team solves their problem with a one-off bot, a custom form, a flow, or a mailbox rule, they create a local optimum. Then another team does the same. You end up with 50 local optima and one global mess. Central policy doesn't fail because people are malicious. It fails because exceptions accumulate. This is why the Microsoft captures intent. ServiceNow executes intent line matters. It's not a slogan, it's an enforcement boundary. Capturing intent means take human language, human context, and human ambiguity and turn it into something structured enough to act on. That's what Copilot is good at inside M365, summarizing, extracting tasks, identifying relevant files, pulling context from meetings and messages. It helps humans articulate. Executing intent means take that structured request and push it through deterministic gates, approvals, routing, SLA timers, risk decisions, and auditable outcomes. That's what ServiceNow is built to do, own the workflow state, the policy surface, and the evidence trail. In other words, Microsoft is your front door, ServiceNow is the factory floor. And you don't run a factory by letting every employee rewrite the assembly line in chat. Now, the integration implication is where most teams get themselves into trouble. They hear integrated experience and assume one tool. What they should hear is one experience, two authorities. Surface service now records in Teams, reduce context switching, but keep workflow state authoritative in ServiceNow or you're back to screenshots and social approvals. And yes, AI can answer questions. That's useful. But answers aren't outcomes. AI without workflows creates noise. AI inside workflows creates outcomes. So the power play here isn't that Microsoft and ServiceNow both have assistants. The power play is that they're competing for the operating layer, and the only sustainable design is to keep engagement and execution separate, then stitch them together with explicit controls. Because if you let the engagement layer write directly into execution without guardrails, you don't get automation. You get accelerated entropy. The operating layer pattern. Events, workflows, decisions, outcomes. If you want a simple model that explains why we have all the tools still produces chaos, it's this chain: events, workflows, decisions, outcomes. Most enterprises are drowning in events, improvising workflows, outsourcing decisions to side channels, and then acting surprised when outcomes are inconsistent. The operating layer exists to make that chain deterministic. Start with events. An event is anything that says something changed and work should happen. A new hire date in the HR system, a security alert from Defender, a manager asking for budget approval in Teams, a CI pipeline failing, an Intune device going non-compliant. Even a human sentence like, "Can you get me access by Friday?" is an event, just unstructured. The problem isn't that events are missing. The problem is that events don't map cleanly to execution. They land in inboxes, chats, and dashboards, and then humans translate them into work by hand. Translation is where meaning gets lost, urgency gets distorted, and risk gets ignored. It's also where you get the classic failure. The event is seen, discussed, and then nobody owns the next step. So the operating layer does something boring and essential. It converts events into workflows. A workflow is not a diagram. It's an executable state machine. Steps, dependencies, ownership, time boundaries, and evidence requirements. It turns "we should" into "the system will not proceed until." This is where the enterprise stops lying to itself, because the system can either enforce sequence or it can't. And if it can't, your process is just people with good intentions and bad memory. Workflows are also where entropy hides. Approvals are the obvious example. Not because approvals are virtuous. They're not. They're expensive. But approvals are where policy meets pressure. If approvals happen in the workflow, you get traceability. If approvals happen in chat, you get plausible deniability. Next, decisions. Decisions are not the same as workflow steps. A workflow step is request manager approval. A decision is this request eligible under policy and low risk enough to approve? Enterprises keep trying to remove decisions from the system because decisions create friction. Then they wonder why risk explodes. Decisions are where governance lives: segregation of duties, entitlement boundaries, finance thresholds, change risk scoring, exception handling. In practical terms, it's the difference between deterministic security and probabilistic security. Deterministic security says, if these conditions are true, the system allows the action and we can prove it later. Probabilistic security says, someone said it was fine in a meeting and hopefully that person still works here during the audit. That distinction matters. And this is where identity becomes the enforcement boundary. Entra ID doesn't just authenticate. It defines who the actor is, what roles they have, what conditional access gates apply, and when you use it correctly, what the blast radius of a bad decision can be. When you don't anchor decisions to identity, you end up anchoring them to social authority. That means the loudest person wins. Finally, outcomes. Outcomes aren't ticket closed. Outcomes are fulfillment completed, access provisioned with evidence, containment executed with approval trail, procurement posted with policy intact, change deployed with rollback path documented. Outcomes are measurable cycle time, measurable compliance, and measurable throughput. Here's the hard reality. Enterprises don't fail at planning. They fail at execution throughput. They fail because work spends its life in the gaps between systems, between teams, between we agreed and we did. The operating layer closes those gaps by keeping state authoritative and transitions controlled. Now AI shows up and tries to be helpful. Copilot can summarize events. It can even propose next steps. Now Assist can pull ServiceNow context and suggest actions. Useful. But the operating layer has one law you don't get to negotiate. Read can be fast and forgiving. Write must be governed. So AI belongs at the event and decision edges, interpreting intent, proposing actions, ranking urgency. But outcomes still require workflows, approvals, and audit trails. Otherwise, you've automated the weakest part of the system, human improvisation. And that's how you get what everyone is quietly building right now: accelerated entropy. Scenario 1, employee onboarding, HR plus IT plus security without email chains. Onboarding is the cleanest way to expose enterprise reality because it looks simple until you try to execute it at scale. New hire equals laptop, accounts, access, maybe a badge, maybe training, maybe a regulated role that needs extra approvals. Everyone nods. Everyone agrees it should be repeatable. Then it hits the org chart. Work starts where humans live: Outlook and Teams. A hiring manager forwards an offer email. HR posts a note. Someone drops "start date is Monday" into a chat. Intent exists loudly in human language. It is not yet work. It's just pressure with a calendar attached. In a 50,000-person global enterprise, the first failure mode shows up immediately. There's no single owner of the end-to-end state. HR owns the employee record. IT owns devices and accounts. Security owns access boundaries. Facilities owns physical access. Finance owns cost centers. Legal might care. Compliance definitely cares. So what actually happens is predictable. People create a chain of messages and call it a process. One email thread becomes the system. A Teams chat becomes the handoff. A spreadsheet becomes the tracker. And the only reason it works at all is because a few humans remember the tribal sequence. Until they don't. This is where the Microsoft and ServiceNow split becomes useful instead of political. Microsoft is where the request is born, because that's where the manager already is. And Copilot can help at that exact moment in a way that's actually valuable. Extract what matters. Start date, location, role, manager, department, cost center, whether the person is internal, contractor, or vendor, and whether they're joining a regulated function. Intent capture, normalization, turning a messy message into structured facts. But capturing intent isn't the win. The win is what happens after that when the workflow has to survive the weekend. ServiceNow has to own the authoritative state. The onboarding case, its tasks, its dependencies, and its gates. HR triggers the joiner event. ServiceNow generates the work. Device requests, identity provisioning, mailbox creation, baseline access, application entitlements, security training, and whatever region-specific requirements exist. And every task has an owner, not a someone. An assignment group, a queue, an SLA and escalation rules that don't rely on a helpful person noticing the message. Here's what most people miss. Identity is not a task. Identity is the enforcement boundary. In onboarding, Entra ID is where the organization decides what the new hire is allowed to become. It's the difference between they should have access to these apps and they do. That means entitlements and group membership can't be granted through side chats. They have to be routed, approved, and auditable. So the right pattern is boring. The manager asks in Teams. The workflow runs in ServiceNow. Identity changes happen under control. If the organization needs privileged access, the workflow has to force explicit approvals and time boundaries. No permanent temporary access. No informal, I'll remove it later. The system either expires access automatically or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you didn't onboard someone. You created future incident fuel. Now, let's talk about where it breaks today, because this is where executives recognize themselves. First, approvals happen in email or chat because it feels faster. That means the approval isn't linked to the action. During an audit, you can't prove who approved what, only that people talked about it. Second, exceptions become the default. Just give them access. They start tomorrow. Then tomorrow becomes 6 months. Then the person changes roles and keeps the old access because nobody owns deprovisioning across domains. Third, visibility is fake. HR says the hire is complete because the HR tasks are complete. IT says the laptop shipped. Security says training is assigned. The new hire says they can't do their job. Every system is locally correct. End to end, it's a failure. So what does good look like in this scenario? Good looks like one request thread in Teams that never pretends to be the authoritative state. It's just the interface. The same conversation can surface a ServiceNow card. Onboarding case created, current status, blockers, and next steps. The manager can ask what's holding this up and get an answer that's derived from workflow state, not someone's memory. It also means controlled exception handling. If someone needs early access, the workflow captures it as an exception with a reason, an approver, a time limit, and a logged change. Exceptions aren't forbidden. They're recorded and constrained. That's entropy management. And the real payoff is offboarding, even though nobody wants to talk about it during onboarding. If you build onboarding as a governed state machine, you can build offboarding as the inverse workflow with the same discipline. That's how you stop orphaned access from becoming a security incident with a press release attached. Onboarding is the happy path, but it's still a stress test. It forces you to decide where intent lives, where execution lives, and whether identity is controlled by policy or by social urgency. Next, the stress test becomes explicit. Security incident response where everyone wants speed and governance is always later. Scenario 2, security incident response, collaboration in teams, execution in workflows. Security incident response is where every nice process dies. Because under pressure, people don't follow policy. They follow urgency. They spin up a team's war room, tag everyone they can think of, and start trading theories, screenshots, and half-finished conclusions. And that part is fine. Collaboration is supposed to be messy. The failure happens when the messy part becomes the control system. In a regulated enterprise, the first question isn't, can we fix it? It's, who is allowed to do what, and who approved it? Containment actions change reality. Disabling accounts, revoking sessions, isolating devices, blocking IPs, rotating secrets, pulling logs, escalating privileges. Those aren't chat decisions. Those are governed operations with blast radius. So here's the pattern that actually works. The alert surfaces in Microsoft, but the execution runs in ServiceNow. The alert might come from Defender, Sentinel, a SOC tool, or a third-party platform. Where does it land? Teams. Because that's where humans are, and that's where humans coordinate. You want the incident channel, the pinned context, the running timeline, the stakeholders, the communications lead, the who's on point assignments. Microsoft is the engagement plane doing exactly what it's built to do. But the moment you start taking action, the system needs an execution plane. Service now owns the security incident record, the workflow state, the tasking, the evidence capture, and the approvals that you can defend later. Triage isn't just, we think it's phishing. It's classification, severity, assignment, SLA triggers, and a controlled flow that can survive shift changes because the incident doesn't care that the night team is different people. This is where the Microsoft captures intent. ServiceNow executes intent, split becomes operational. In Teams, someone says, we need to disable this account now. It's actively exfiltrating. That sentence is intent. It's also a liability. In a mature model, that intent becomes an action request, a workflow step in ServiceNow that says disable account X with an approver, a reason, a timestamp, and a recorded outcome. If the organization uses privileged identity management, the workflow drives that elevation through controlled gates. If it doesn't, the workflow at least forces a documented approval and ties it to the change. Because the ugly truth is this: the fastest way to create security debt is to let containment happen through informal authority. The other failure mode is evidence. In a security incident, evidence isn't nice to have. It's the difference between a controllable incident and an audit nightmare. Teams conversations don't give you evidence. They give you a transcript. ServiceNow can force evidence. Log links, indicators, containment actions, impacted assets, who approved, what was changed, and when. Nobody likes documentation in the middle of a fire. That's why it has to be baked into the workflow, not left to human discipline. Now layer in AI, because this is where everyone gets confused and starts building the wrong thing. Copilot is great at summarizing Teams threads, pulling key decisions, finding the file that contains the indicator list, and generating a draft comms update. That's real value because it reduces cognitive load. But Copilot doesn't get to execute containment just because it can write a confident paragraph. Now Assist is great at the ServiceNow side, summarizing case history, suggesting related incidents, pulling knowledge articles, proposing next actions based on prior patterns, and helping agents write resolution notes. That's useful because it speeds decisions inside the execution plane. But here's the law. AI can propose, workflows decide, read operations can be fast, write operations must be governed. So the correct flow is: AI accelerates triage and decision-making, but execution remains deterministic. If you let an AI agent just take care of it, you've replaced human improvisation with probabilistic improvisation at machine speed. That's not automation. That's a faster incident. In the composite enterprise, 50K employees, multiple regions, heavy regulation, this also becomes a communications problem. The war room needs an external narrative, leadership updates, customer comms, legal review, and operational timelines. Teams is still the best place to coordinate that, but ServiceNow needs to remain the authoritative timeline for what was actually done. Otherwise, the post-incident review becomes a debate about whose memory is correct. So good in this scenario looks like Teams for coordination and shared awareness. ServiceNow for triage, assignment, approvals, evidence, and outcome tracking. Identity as the enforcement boundary for privileged actions. AI as an accelerant inside the guardrails, not a replacement for them. And the payoff is measurable. Lower decision latency, fewer manual handoffs, cleaner audit trails, and fewer temporary access grants that survive into the next quarter. Reflection pause. If you're listening to this and thinking, yes, this sounds familiar, that's the point. None of this is hypothetical. This is how your organization already works, just without an owner. Now take that same discipline and move it out of the SOC and into finance, where pressure comes from quarter end instead of attackers. Scenario 3, finance approvals. Procure to pay without policy erosion. Finance is where people finally admit they don't want better collaboration. They want enforceable policy, because the failure mode isn't that nobody can request spend. The failure mode is that spend gets approved in the least defensible place possible. An email thread, a Teams message, or a hallway conversation that later becomes "we all agreed." Procure to pay is basically the same pattern as onboarding and security response, just with different nouns. The work starts in Microsoft because that's where the pressure lives. Someone forwards a vendor quote. Someone tags a finance lead in Teams. Can we get this approved today? Quarter end. Someone drops a spreadsheet link and asks for a thumbs up. That's intent. And it's also the beginning of policy erosion, because finance policy doesn't fail through malice. It fails through impatience. Approvals get rushed. Thresholds get ignored. Segregation of duties becomes, can you just approve it for me? And once the organization proves it can bypass controls when it's inconvenient, it will keep doing it. That's not culture. That's system behavior. So in the composite enterprise, 50K employees, regulated industry, the operating layer has to be explicit. Microsoft captures the request and the context, but ServiceNow enforces the gates that make the request legitimate. The way it usually breaks is almost boring. A request lands in Teams. The approver is on mobile. They reply, approved, because it's faster than opening the portal. Someone screenshots that message and attaches it to something, maybe. Then procurement moves forward because we have approval. The ERP eventually records the transaction because that's what ERPs do, but the ERP doesn't know whether the approval met policy. It just knows the transaction exists. And when audit time arrives, the organization tries to reconstruct governance from scattered artifacts. An email, a Teams thread, a PDF, a memory. That's not an audit trail. That's archaeology. So what does good look like without turning finance into a bureaucratic museum exhibit? Good looks like letting teams stay the front door. Let the request start where people already work. Let Copilot help translate the messy human ask into structured fields. Vendor, amount, cost center, description, urgency, whether it's CapEx or OpEx, and which policy applies. That's intent capture. But the moment the request becomes real money, execution moves to a workflow state machine. ServiceNow owns the approval workflow because it can enforce sequence, thresholds, and separation of duties. It can route automatically, manager approval under one threshold, finance approval under another, security review if it touches a risky vendor category, procurement review if a preferred vendor exists, legal review if contract terms trigger it. The point isn't complexity. The point is enforceable branching with an auditable why. And the ERP stays exactly where it belongs, the system of record. It posts the purchase order, it pays the invoice, it preserves the financial truth. ServiceNow sits above it as the system of action. It orchestrates the human chain that makes the transaction acceptable, then hands the result to the ERP with evidence attached. This is also where executives finally see the cost of quick exceptions. Every exception to approval policy is an entropy generator. It feels like speed. It actually creates ambiguity. And ambiguity is what auditors charge for, not emotionally. Financially, in time, remediation, and the constant tax of controls that nobody trusts. So the real value proposition in finance isn't faster approvals as a vanity metric. It's consistent enforcement under pressure. Because quarter end is basically a recurring incident, except it's self-inflicted and everyone pretends it's normal. Now, the integration pattern matters. If all you do is surface finance requests inside teams as read-only cards, you've reduced context switching, but you haven't stopped bypass behavior. People still approve in chat because it's convenient. Retrieval doesn't fix execution. So the operating layer has to support actual actions under control. Approvers can approve from within teams, but the approval must be written into the ServiceNow workflow state, tied to identity and logged as a structured decision, not as a message, not as a reaction icon, as a controlled transition. And because finance is a write-heavy domain, approvals, routing, updates, the read fast, write governed rule becomes non-negotiable. You start with assisted drafting and summarization, sure, but you keep writes supervised and auditable. Otherwise, you've just built a faster way to create non-compliance. If you want the executive version of this scenario, it's simple. Microsoft is where spend pressure gets expressed. ServiceNow is where spend policy gets enforced. ERP is where spend gets recorded. When those three roles stay clean, cycle time improves, audit findings drop, and nobody has to ask, who approved this? Like it's a mystery novel. And once finance works this way, it becomes impossible to keep pretending ServiceNow is just it. It's the enterprise execution layer. Next, take the same pattern back to the place most organizations think they understand, the major incident war room, where teams feels like the whole story until change control shows up. Scenario 4. Major IT incident plus change, the war room versus the control system. Major incidents are where organizations confuse adrenaline with control. The war room spins up in teams because that's where humans can coordinate at speed. Voice, chat, screen shares, a running narrative, and the one thing people actually need in the first 10 minutes, shared situational awareness. Who's on, what's impacted, what's the latest signal, what are we trying next? Teams is perfect for that. It's also the place where most enterprises accidentally move change control into a chat thread and call it agility. Here's the uncomfortable truth. A major incident is not just fix it fast. It's fix it fast without making the blast radius worse. And the only mechanism enterprises have for controlling blast radius is change management. Not because KAB meetings are fun, because production doesn't care about feelings. So this scenario is the cleanest proof of the split brain model. Teams is the war room. ServiceNow is the control system. In the composite enterprise, a major incident usually starts with a flood of symptoms. Users can't log in, an API is timing out, a region is degraded, or a minor change from earlier in the day quietly becomes the root cause of a widespread outage. The first job is triage and comms. That belongs in Microsoft. You want incident channels, stakeholder comms, and the ability to brief leadership without digging through 10 portals. But the second job, the dangerous one, is execution. Execution is assign tasks with owners and time boundaries, coordinate remediation steps, create emergency changes, capture approvals, record what was done, and preserve enough evidence that the post-incident review isn't a religious argument. That work needs an authoritative state machine. This is where ServiceNow earns its keep. A team's war room can tell a story. It cannot enforce one. A team's thread can say, we agreed to reboot the database. It cannot prove who authorized it, whether the rollback plan existed, or whether that reboot was part of a controlled change sequence. And in a regulated environment, we agreed is not governance, it's a liability. So the right design is boring and strict. The major incident record lives in ServiceNow. It owns the timeline, the tasks, the comms artifacts, and the dependency map between actions. The team's channel is linked to the major incident record, not treated as a parallel universe. Collaboration happens in teams. Authority stays in ServiceNow. Now the part that always collapses under pressure, emergency change. In the war room, someone says, we need to push a config change right now. Another person says, just do it, we'll backfill later. And this is exactly how temporary bypass becomes permanent policy decay. Because the bypass isn't the outage, the bypass is the future outage. If you let major incidents teach your teams that controls are optional, you don't get faster recovery. You get repeatable chaos. So emergency change has to be a first-class workflow, not an apology. ServiceNow can do that. Create the emergency change record as part of the major incident workflow, enforce the minimum approvals required, capture the reason for urgency, link the impacted services, and record the implementation and rollback steps. It can keep the blast radius bounded even when humans are improvising. And yes, it adds friction. That's the point. Friction is what turns someone pushed a thing into the organization can defend why it pushed a thing. This is also where good looks counterintuitive to teams-first organizations. Good does not mean forcing everyone out of teams. Good means letting teams be the interface while refusing to let it become the system of record for execution. The incident commander can run comms in Teams, but the tasks are created, owned, and closed in ServiceNow. The approvals can be surfaced in Teams, but the approval state must be written to the change record tied to identity with an audit trail. This is where AI tempts people into the wrong move. Copilot can summarize the war room and draft status updates. Great. Now, Assist can generate post-incident review drafts and resolution notes, also useful. But AI cannot be allowed to convert we think into we changed without controls, because write operations are blast radius multipliers. So the measurable outcome isn't we had a great war room. It's did the incident produce a clean, authoritative timeline? Did every action have an owner? Did emergency changes have approvals and rollback paths? Did the organization avoid creating new security and compliance debt while restoring service? Teams makes the war room fast. ServiceNow makes the recovery defensible. And if those two responsibilities blur, you don't get resilience. You get a group chat with production permissions, integration, reality. Connectors give answers. Orchestration gets outcomes. Now take those 4 scenarios and ask the only question that matters once you leave the whiteboard. How do these two worlds actually connect without creating a new category of failure? Because integration gets marketed like it's a single thing. It isn't. In practice, there are 2 modes, and confusing them is how organizations end up with a shiny demo and unchanged throughput. Mode 1 is read, mode 2 is write. Read integration is about answers. It's search, indexing, summaries, and quick lookups. Microsoft has a clean story here. Microsoft Graph connectors can index ServiceNow content, so Copilot can retrieve it in the flow of work. Incidents, knowledge articles, catalog items. Those are common connector patterns. People ask in Teams, Copilot answers with the relevant ServiceNow context, and nobody has to alt-tab into another portal just to find a link. That is real value, but it is not orchestration. It's an information plane. It reduces context switching. It reduces time to knowledge. It reduces the where do I even find this friction that burns hours across large companies. And for early adoption, read-only is politically easy. Lower risk, minimal change control, fewer permission arguments, and far less blast radius if something is misscoped. This is why read-only wins first, because everyone can agree that finding answers faster is good, and almost nobody wants to be the executive who approved letting an AI write to production systems. Now, mode 2, write integration. Write integration is about outcomes, creating the request, updating the record, approving the step, executing the workflow transition, triggering the containment task, posting the approval decision, calling the API that changes reality. Write is orchestration. And orchestration is where governance lives or dies. Microsoft's path to write typically runs through controlled action frameworks. Copilot Studio connectors, approved plugins, explicit API calls, and tooling that can be governed and monitored. ServiceNow's side runs through its workflow engine. Flow Designer, Integration Hub, approval engines, and the record state machine that actually owns the process. The architectural point is simple. Connectors can tell you what's happening. Orchestration makes something happen. If you stop at read integration, you'll build what looks like progress but behaves like theater. Copilot can summarize an incident. Great. Someone still has to open ServiceNow, create tasks, chase approvals, and record evidence. Copilot can find the right knowledge article. Great. Someone still has to execute the onboarding workflow and enforce identity gates. Retrieval without execution is just faster browsing. This is the line where most enterprises get stuck, because moving from read to write forces 3 ugly conversations. First, permissions. Read can tolerate broad access patterns. Write cannot. When you let something create or update records, you are delegating authority. And authority needs least privilege, explicit scope, and revocation paths. Otherwise, the integration account becomes a permanent superuser, and you've created a bot-shaped insider threat. Second, audit. If a workflow step gets approved from Teams, you need to know who approved it, under what identity, with what context, and what record state changed as a result. If you can't prove that, you didn't automate approvals. You created an unauditable bypass with a nicer interface. Third, change control and blast radius. Read failures are annoying. Write failures are incidents. The moment actions can be triggered from the engagement layer, You need to think like an architect. How do you limit scope, monitor behavior, roll back mistakes, and keep the system deterministic? So the sane operating stance is phased. Start with search and read-only surfaces to reduce context switching and prove adoption. Clean up knowledge hygiene because AI search will amplify whatever mess you already have. Then graduate to governed actions, a limited set of requests, updates, and approvals where workflow state remains authoritative in ServiceNow. Writes are supervised at first because supervised writes are entropy control. Only then do you talk about agentic execution because agents that can write without guardrails aren't helpful. They are probabilistic operators. The integration reality stripped of the sales gloss is this. Microsoft can be the best front end your enterprise has ever had. ServiceNow has to remain the execution engine your enterprise can defend. If you can't separate answering from acting, you will automate, but you'll automate the wrong thing. Copilot plus Now Assist, 2 brains, 2 jurisdictions. Now we get to the part everyone wants to skip to. Copilot and Now Assist, 2 assistants, 2 brands, 2 demos where someone types a sentence and the system politely pretends enterprise execution is simple. Here's the correct framing. These are 2 brains with 2 jurisdictions, and if you don't define jurisdiction, you get a constitutional crisis at scale. Copilot's jurisdiction is the Microsoft productivity estate. It understands meetings, mail, chats, files, calendars, and the messy human context that lives inside M365. It's good at turning unstructured intent into something coherent. Summaries, action items, drafts, and what did we decide in that meeting? It reduces the cost of thinking and searching. Now, Assist's jurisdiction is ServiceNow operational reality. It understands records, workflows, knowledge bases, catalog items, case history, assignment groups, SLAs, and the governed state machine that actually moves work. It's good at turning operational context into controlled next steps. Classification, routing, suggested actions, response drafting, and workflow-aware assistance for agents. So if you want a single sentence that doesn't lie, Copilot is fluent in human context. Now, Assist is fluent in operational state. That's why 2 assistants is not redundancy, it's separation of concerns. But it's also where organizations make a classic mistake. They assume the assistant that can talk should also be allowed to write. That's how you get AI actions that are really just permission drift wearing a lab coat. The integration pattern that actually survives audit is a handoff model. Copilot operates in teams as the engagement surface. It captures the request in human terms, pulls relevant Microsoft context, and then hands off to ServiceNow when the next step requires workflow state. That handoff can look like a ServiceNow card, a linked record, or a guided request flow that lands inside the ServiceNow workflow engine. Now, Assist does the inverse when needed. From inside ServiceNow, it can call Microsoft context to help with communication artifacts, drafting an incident update email, generating a PowerPoint summary for leadership, or pulling relevant meeting notes, without pretending that the Microsoft artifact is the authoritative record of the incident. This is not one AI to rule them all. It's 2 assistants that delegate properly. Now, the hidden complexity is not the models. It's grounding and permissions. Grounding is the question of what the assistant is allowed to know and what sources it uses to generate an answer. Copilot is grounded in Microsoft Graph and whatever your tenant exposes through permissions and connectors. Now, Assist is grounded in Service. Now, records and knowledge sources governed by ServiceNow access controls and user criteria. If you blur those boundaries, you get confident nonsense or, worse, confident data leakage. Permissions are the harder landmine. Copilot can only act within the permissions of the user and the configured connectors. Same story with Now Assist. That sounds comforting until someone fixes a failing integration by giving the connector account broad access. Then it works, then nobody reduces it. Then you've created a silent super user that will outlive the project. That's not misconfiguration, that's design omission. This is where jurisdiction becomes a security control, not a diagram. The assistants can only be as safe as the identity and authorization model they operate under. And that brings you right back to the operating layer law. Read can be generous, write must be governed. So a sane design looks like this. Copilot can read ServiceNow context through connectors and summarize it for the user in Teams. Low blast radius, high adoption. When the user wants to do something, create a request, approve a change, trigger containment, the system routes that into ServiceNow as a workflow step with explicit identity, logging, and approval state. Rights are either supervised or constrained by policy. And if someone wants fully agentic behavior, just take care of it, the answer is still no. Not because AI is bad, because enterprises run on constrained authority, not vibes. So the power play isn't Microsoft versus ServiceNow assistants. The power play is who owns the next step when the assistant finishes talking. If Copilot closes a conversation but no workflow change state, you created a nicer chat experience. If Now Assist proposes an action but it can't execute it under governance, you created better suggestions. The operating layer only exists when the state machine moves, with evidence. 2 brains, 2 jurisdictions. And 1 non-negotiable boundary. The assistant can speak anywhere, but it can only write where you can audit it. AI changes who executes work, deterministic workflows versus probabilistic agents. Now, the uncomfortable part, AI doesn't just change how work is requested, it changes who is executing work. And enterprises are about to learn the difference between deterministic systems and probabilistic ones the hard way. A deterministic workflow is boring on purpose. Given the same inputs, it produces the same outcome. Same routing, same approvals, same evidence requirements, same SLA timers, same escalation paths. It behaves like an authorization compiler. You feed it policy and state, and it decides what's allowed next. A probabilistic agent is different. It interprets, it guesses, it ranks options, it can be right for the wrong reasons, and it can be wrong with high confidence. That's not a flaw. That's the nature of LLM-based systems. They generate plausible output, not guaranteed truth. So the enterprise decision isn't AI or workflows. It's where does probabilistic behavior belong, and where is it forbidden? AI belongs at the edges of the operating layer. Intake, summarization, classification suggestions, prioritization, and drafting. It belongs anywhere. The primary job is to reduce human cognitive load. AI does not belong as an unconstrained writer into your execution plane. Because once an agent can write, it can create state transitions. It can approve. It can provision access. It can close an incident. It can trigger containment. It can move money. It can change reality. And that's the exact moment your organization stops being deterministic. You become probabilistic by design. This is why human in the loop isn't a temporary phase. It's the only sustainable operating model for write operations at scale. Read operations can move autonomous earlier. Let the assistant fetch records, summarize threads, draft responses, and propose the next step. Read failures are annoying, but survivable. They create confusion, not catastrophe. Write operations must start supervised. Every write needs an approval boundary, a logged identity, and a rollback story. Not because compliance people are mean, because entropy is real, and write access is the fastest way to manufacture it. So the pattern is simple. AI proposes, a workflow enforces, a human authorizes, the system records. Over time, some writes can become more autonomous, but only when you can prove that the action is low risk, reversible, and observable. That's not optimism, that's engineering discipline. And this is where governance beats model quality. People keep asking, is the model good enough? Wrong question. Models will improve. Your governance won't fix itself. If you don't build the guardrails now, you'll just accelerate your existing dysfunction later. Governance means least privilege for connectors and agents, explicit scopes, approval gates for state changes, and audit trails that survive executive turnover. It also means you can answer the only question auditors care about. Who did what, under what authority, and why? Rollback paths matter here more than anyone wants to admit. If an agent creates a ServiceNow change record and schedules work, can you stop it? If it grants access, can you revoke it automatically? If it updates a security incident, can you reconstruct the exact sequence of actions without relying on chat logs? If you can't, you don't have automation. You have accelerated risk. This is why AI inside workflows creates outcomes. Isn't a motivational line, it's an architectural constraint. AI should live inside the workflow state machine, not beside it. The workflow provides determinism, steps, gates, evidence, and ownership. AI provides judgment support, summarize, recommend, and draft. Together, you get throughput without losing control. Without the workflow, AI becomes a noise generator. More suggestions, more messages, more help, and no authoritative state change. People feel busy, nothing finishes. And when AI does start finishing things without workflows, it finishes them in whatever way seems plausible at the time. That's conditional chaos with better grammar. So the strategic move for the enterprise isn't to chase fully autonomous agents. The strategic move is to redesign execution so that autonomy is a controlled gradient. Read-first autonomy, supervised writes, then selective automation where risk is bounded. The system doesn't care about your intent, it only respects what you enforce. Failure modes, workflow, entropy, shadow automation, and permission drift. Every integration story sounds clean until it hits the three forces that always win in the real enterprise: urgency, convenience, and forgetting. Those forces don't break platforms, they break your assumptions. And they always express themselves the same way: workflow entropy, shadow automation, and permission drift. Workflow entropy is the quiet killer. It starts as a temporary exception. A manager needs access today. A procurement approval gets rushed because quarter end. A change gets pushed without the formal step because the outage clock is running. Nobody thinks they're undermining governance. They think they're being helpful. Then that exception becomes the actual process. Not because anyone chose it, but because the exception path is faster than the policy path. People root around friction the same way water roots around rocks. Over time, your documented workflow becomes ceremonial, and your real workflow becomes DM the right person, get a thumbs up, move on. That's why conditional access exceptions, emergency approvals, and bypass routes are entropy generators. They don't just create one gap, they teach the organization that state transitions are optional. Once state transitions are optional, Your system of action becomes a logging tool. It records the mess after the fact. It doesn't control it. The second failure mode is shadow automation. This is where teams and Power Automate become a parallel universe. Someone builds a flow that posts a message to a channel when an email arrives. Someone builds a form that creates a task list in Planner. Someone wires up approvals in chat because it's just easier. And on day one, it works. Of course it works. Local automation always works locally. The problem is what it displaces, governed orchestration. Shadow automation doesn't fail because it's malicious. It fails because it's unowned. No life cycle, no audit story, no defined blast radius. The builder leaves, the flow keeps running, and the next incident response includes, nobody knows what triggers this, but it's been doing it for months. That's what happens when you treat the engagement plane as the execution plane. Now, the third failure mode is the one that makes security teams tired, permission drift. Integrations require permissions, AI assistants require permissions, connectors require permissions. And when something fails during setup, the quickest fix is always the same. Just give it more access. So you create an integration account, you grant broad graph permissions, you grant broad ServiceNow roles, you get the demo working, everyone claps, then nobody goes back and reduces scope. 6 months later, that account has more access than most humans. It's a permanent super user with no human manager, no quarterly access review, and no business owner who can explain why it exists. That's not misconfiguration, that's architectural erosion. And permission drift doesn't stay in one place. It spreads. A second connector gets deployed and reuses the same account. A third flow depends on it. Now, you can't fix it without breaking business-critical automation. That's how security debt becomes operational dependency. Here's the weird part. AI accelerates all three failure modes. Workflow entropy gets faster because AI makes it easier to justify exceptions. Copilot says it's low risk. Shadow automation gets faster because AI makes it easier to build flows without understanding the governance model. Permission drift gets faster because agents that can act need permissions, and people will overscope them to avoid friction. That's why AI without workflows creates noise. But AI with bad workflows creates damage, so the prevention strategy is not a checklist. It's an operating stance you enforce. First, treat exceptions as first-class objects. If someone needs a bypass, capture it as an exception in the workflow with a reason, an approver, and an expiration. No expiration means it's not an exception, it's a hidden policy change. Second, treat automations as production assets. If it can write, it needs ownership, lifecycle management, and controls. Otherwise, it's a ghost system. Third, treat permissions as temporary until proven otherwise. Least privilege is not a principle, it's entropy management. If you don't continuously pull scope back, it will only expand. The workflow-first operating model, re-platform execution in phases. So if the diagnosis is workflow fragmentation, the treatment isn't buy more apps. It's re-platforming execution, not migrating tickets, not rolling out another chatbot, re-platforming the operating layer, where work starts, how it moves, who can change state, and how the organization proves what happened later. And the first step is the one everyone skips because it's not glamorous. Mapping execution, not process mapping as a PowerPoint hobby. Execution mapping. Where does work actually begin? What are the real approval gates? What systems change state? And what metrics define done across domains? If you can't draw the end-to-end chain for onboarding, incident containment, finance approvals, and emergency change, you don't have processes. You have traditions. Now, the split of ownership is non-negotiable. ServiceNow owns workflow state, routing, audit, enforcement. Microsoft owns collaboration, content, intent capture, and the surfaces where humans live. This is not a preference. It's how you prevent authority drift. Because the moment Teams becomes the authoritative system for approvals or changes, you've turned chat into a control plane. And chat is not a control plane. It is not. So the operating model is phased because enterprises don't change in one cutover. They degrade and improve in gradients. Phase 1 is about reducing context switching without moving authority. This is where you embed ServiceNow into Teams, surface records, and use search connectors so people can find knowledge, incidents, and catalog items from where they already work. It's intentionally read-heavy. The goal is adoption and friction removal. Fewer portals, fewer where do I do this, fewer screenshots as status updates. But it's also where you clean your knowledge hygiene, because AI search will amplify whatever mess you've allowed to accumulate. If the knowledge base is stale, your new AI assistant will simply produce confident, stale answers at scale. That's not transformation, that's automated misinformation. Phase 2 is governed actions. This is where you stop pretending that retrieval equals execution. Pick a small set of write paths that map cleanly to workflows. Submit a catalog request, update an incident, approve a step, escalate a case, open a change. Then make those writes flow through ServiceNow as authoritative state transitions. The user can click approve in Teams. Fine, But the approval must land as a workflow transition in ServiceNow tied to identity, logged, and constrained by policy. The engagement plane can host the button. The execution plane owns the truth. This is also where you enforce least privilege like you mean it. Integration accounts don't get broad access because someone had a demo deadline. Agents don't get write scope just because it's easier. Every connector and assistant gets scoped to the minimum set of actions required, and it gets reviewed like any other privileged identity. Because permissions are not a setup step, they are an operational liability. Phase 3 is agentic execution, and it's where most organizations rush because the demos look magical. But agentic execution only works when two conditions are already true. The workflow state machine is clean and the right controls are enforceable. Otherwise, you're not deploying agents. You're deploying entropy accelerators. So the rule is simple. Autonomous reads can expand quickly. Supervised writes expand slowly. And only after you've proven that an action is low risk, reversible, and observable does it earn more autonomy. This is also where observability stops being optional. If an agent can propose actions, you need to see what it proposed, what was approved, what it executed, and what changed as a result. You need traceability across Microsoft and ServiceNow, the intent source, the workflow state, and the outcome record. If you can't reconstruct the chain, you have no governance. You have vibes. And the biggest architectural discipline in this whole model is rollback. Workflows without rollback are just scripted confidence. Every write path needs an undo story, revoke access, cancel procurement, roll back a change, reopen the incident, restore the prior state. Otherwise, your automation becomes a one-way door, and one-way doors are how incidents become outages. So the workflow first operating model is basically enterprise humility formalized. Humans generate intent in Microsoft. Systems execute intent in ServiceNow. AI accelerates the edges, not the center. And control is what survives pressure. That's the point. Not convenience, not novelty. Control that still works when people are tired, urgent, and improvising. Execution throughput is the actual power play. The power play isn't Copilot versus Now Assist. It's building an operating layer where intent becomes governed execution every time. If you want the next episode, it's on where governance fails first, identity, connectors, or quick exceptions that become policy. Subscribe and watch that one next.